The Senate has passed aid to Ukraine. Now, it's not just aid to Ukraine, it's also aid to Israel and aid to Taiwan. And I think it even has a sweetener fentanyl provision to try to sign on more people who don't support it after immigration negotiations broke down. For those of you who don't know, I'll do a quick rundown before we get back to modern day. Back during Kevin McCarthy's House speakership run, there was an attempt to pass more Ukraine aid, and it was going to be $24 billion attached to some continuing resolution or attached to some budget bill. And Kevin McCarthy, in an attempt to keep his speakership position and please the fringes of his party, said, no, we're going to do it some other way. Maybe we're going to add something else to it. And he didn't pass it. And then he fell through anyway. So not only did he not pass it, but he also had his own speakership collapse in on itself. Then there was a bunch of chaos in the House, and they went through multiple speakership options. Like Tom Emmer was a consideration at one point. I know they had multiple votes on Jim Jordan. I know they had multiple votes on Steve Scalise. There were some other people that were considered. I remember, like, what was it? Ron Donald. I forget all the people that were trying to throw their hats into the ring. But eventually, Mike Johnson gets chosen. Not because he has a lot of political experience, not because he is necessarily like some particularly influential guy, but quite frankly, because after so many speakership votes, some of them becoming like nearly record-breaking, with it being the most speakership votes in like over 100 years or something, they just kind of wanted to pick somebody they could all agree on, no matter if they were good or not. And Mike Johnson is somebody they could agree on just because basically no one hated him, at least at the time. There was considerations for Tom Emmer, but one of the things that ended up undermining him is that in recent years there was a law passed, or there was legislation put through the House and Senate to try to legalize gay marriage. Now that might be confusing because gay marriage is already legalized, but after Roe versus Wade was overturned, some American Democrats had the forethought to think, well, if Roe versus Wade was overturned, then it is possible that also the Dobbs ruling could be overturned and gay people could lose the right to marriage, the constitutionally ordained right to marriage. Therefore, let's pass it in the House and Senate just in case, so we have that protection. Tom Emmer, thinking he lived in the year 2022, was like, oh, okay, this is reasonable. It seems that I look at this polling data, and the vast majority of Americans are now fine with gay marriage. I want children to be raised by two parents. I want to, marriage is good. And so he voted in favor of it. Well, that was the thing that ended up spoiling him. And Mike Johnson is as Christian and as die-hard Christian as Christian can be. So he gets elected into the position. He says that they're not going to abandon Ukraine, and then proceeded to block Ukraine aid going through for the next 100 days. A disaster. It was a disaster. From October forward, after Kevin McCarthy lost his position in September, we have been given the runaround. At first, it was, no. We cannot pass individual aid to Ukraine. There has to be some compromise. And so then Senate Democrats and Senate Republicans, including Senate border hawk James Lankford, sat down, negotiated for 5 months, and came forward with a deal which addressed many Republican priorities, including, if you're an undocumented person trying to cross over from, say, Guatemala, if you could stop somewhere else first, then you cannot claim asylum in the United States. It also added automatic triggers for shutting down the border if border crossings exceed a certain amount, the amount being 5,000 a day, which would, if in place right now, immediately trigger a closure at the border. There were a bunch of other things that were given to them and a bunch of Democratic priorities that were left off the table. Even there were some that were addressed, like funding for immigration judges, but ones like, for example, citizenship for for Dreamers, a solution for that was not achieved. Then the Senate bill is put forward. Trump sees it, realizes that his main election issue is immigration, and if there's a bipartisan compromise on immigration, Biden might be able to run on that, sinks it for it being campaign season, and then after it sinks, this is the position we're at. And I want to read you Lindsey Graham's speech here, his little message as to why he voted against it despite his history of being a foreign policy hawk.
25 has donated $5. Jesus Christ, Dylan, how can fucking Republicans sleep so soundly at night knowing their actions is directly causing the death of so many people in Ukraine?
I wish I could tell you that, because, I'm not the one voting against the aid, and it's hard for me to sleep soundly at night, because honestly, I feel I feel pretty ashamed of my country and pretty ashamed of the people I share it with. It'd be one thing if Mike Johnson just came out and said, I am an isolationist, I'm against aid to anyone. but he's also been trying fervently to pass aid to Israel during the whole time. In fact, he tried to separate Ukraine and Israel aid, which honestly I'd be fine with if we hold it an up or down vote on both things, because there's a good chance there's a lot of people who'd want to vote for Ukraine aid. Like for example, like someone like maybe like Ro Khanna or an AOC, but didn't want to vote for Israel aid, and vice versa. I know there's Republicans who wouldn't want to vote for Ukraine aid, but would want to vote for Israel aid, like Marjorie Taylor Greene. But they won't hold a vote, and they just want to vote on the Israel aid. And while they're saying, oh, Ukraine is an endless money sink, Israel has been, post-World War II, the #1 American ally for foreign aid. Over $300 billion since the end of World War II. Is that not a money sink? Is that not something? And mind you, that $300 billion, I don't think that's inflation adjusted, baby. I don't think it is. Point is, I think it's hypocritical. If it was just, I'm an isolationist, then I'd be like, okay, if we something here we disagree on principle, I can go there and fight it. But with him starting it with, I won't abandon Ukrainians, and him being okay with aid to certain countries, even if I disagree with those, sending aid to those other countries, I think it's unprincipled. I think it's scummy. I think it's leveraging the lives of Ukrainians in order to try to get your priorities that are completely unrelated through, after he promised at the start of the speakership that he wouldn't do these big omnibus bills because he didn't like the idea, at Matt Gaetz's suggestion, by the way, of having legislators have to vote on completely unrelated things as part of the same package, because then you spend a bunch of money on stuff that is not necessary when you could have just spent it on the smaller issue if you split it up. Point is, I think it's hypocritical. I wouldn't be able to sleep with myself, because it's not only saying it's not my problem, it's him acknowledging that the United States should do it at the start, indicating that he would when I had concerns due to his shitty voting record on it, with him only approving the Lend-Lease Act at the very start of the war. Everything else, Ukraine-wise, he's voted against. He's got a terrible voting record on it. But at the start of his speakership, he said, well, I'm the House Speaker, so I have to represent, the interests of the country, and we got to support Ukraine, and I will not abandon Ukraine. That is why I wouldn't be able to sleep at night. That is why I wouldn't be able to sleep at night. Because if I told anyone, an ally, a neighbor, an old lady that said, hey, I need you to help me walk my dog, and I said I'm going to do it, and then I don't do it, but the whole time I'm not doing it, I'm making up excuses to delay it as it gets worse and worse and worse and worse, yeah, I wouldn't be able to sleep with myself. And I don't think Mike Johnson should be able to sleep with himself either. I hope he has long, sleepless nights. Especially since every day is paid in real blood by real human beings dying in a real war, when we know that a lot of the death toll that's coming is due to a lack of ammunition, as soldiers on the front line have to put up with stronger and stronger Russian attacks that are being suppressed less and less, and artillery fire that is being suppressed less and less because the Ukrainians have less for counter battery fire. So yeah, I wouldn't be able to sleep with myself. I wouldn't be able to live with myself. I don't think the term is sleep with myself. I meant like, sounds silly though. Anyway, yep. That's my answer to that question. So Lindsey Graham here, as they've now passed another bill through the Senate bill being, what was it? I forget the exact number, but the bill just being Israel aid, Ukraine aid, Taiwan aid, and fentanyl. They separated it because Trump didn't want it. It's like, okay, fine, let's do what we were originally going to do in the first place then. Now that that has happened, Lindsey Graham, this previously known as a foreign policy hawk, has come out against it. He's come out against it. And he's not the only one. Other senators did as well. Let's read. This whole process has been a complete debacle. While I support the House-passed border security bill, H.R. 2, they were unable to get any Democratic votes in the House, making it impossible to pick up 11 Democrats in the Senate to get the necessary 60 votes. The House actually lost 2 Republican votes on H.R. 2, and when the Senate previously voted on the legislation, we lost 1 Republican and did not get any Democratic votes. So there's no way that a Democratic Senate or presidency or House would pass H.R. 2. In fact, even if the Republicans get a majority in the House, expand the majority in the House, and they get a majority in the Senate, they're going to still need 60 senators in order to pass H.R. 2. And if you were unwilling to compromise with Democrats when they were giving you many of your priorities in order to get a national security priority through, something that's important for the entire country, How are you going to expect to get through HR2 even if you have electoral success come 2024? Why would Chuck Schumer give you that? Why would Hakeem Jeffries give you that if something came up in the House? Point is, HR2 is a non-starter. Democrats won in 2020 against Trump-era immigration policies. Not that surprising, they have different immigration policies. Democracy is about compromise. You weren't willing to compromise. And in fact, the fact that they didn't have a solution for Dreamers makes me not that, sad about the bill falling or the bill failing, because there was a lot of priorities that we didn't get through, and there were some provisions I wasn't too happy with, and I know a lot of other progressive immigration activists weren't as well. I know a lot of people in CASA, that's an organization that's active in my area, an immigrants' right group, they weren't happy. But the bill sunk now. Bill's gone. They're not going to get their compromise. We need to find a solution to the border crisis, not the idea that falls short. As to the bipartisan bill negotiated, there were many positive aspects, but there were more to be done. We weren't going to get any more. It was 5 months of negotiation. Again, I'm not angry about the bill falling apart necessarily, because I never really wanted that compromise, because I don't think we got enough. But the thing that gets me about it is that we lost 5 months of valuable time as the Ukrainians were waiting, and the Russians inch closer and closer to Avdiivka. If we would have passed the aid sooner, then the people fighting Avdiivka would have more shells to fire back. And who knows if the Russians in the city would be crunching the supply line they are right now into Avdiivka, hurting the logistics teams and making it a game of Russian roulette, while you're trying to get in logistics into the city. It's a game of chance just to get in and get out. As to the bipartisan bill negotiated, there were many positive aspects, but there was more to be done. Let me read through all of this. Let me get through all of this. I keep stopping at everything, so let me just read through all of this. However, when it came to changing the bill, the fix was in. There was no desire by either Senate leadership team to have a robust debate like we did with the Gang of Eight bill, which lasted weeks, because they wanted to move on Ukraine. I have been saying for months that helping Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan are extremely important national security imperatives for the United States. The Ukrainians have fought like tigers, but they need more assistance. Over time, they will continue to deal blows to Russia. Pulling the plug on Ukraine only invites further aggression in other areas of the world, particularly China. Okay, so he's saying it is a national security priority for him. However, as I have been consistently saying, we must deal with our border first. Could you imagine, we're trying to get geared to the Soviets because we don't want the Nazis to dominate all of Europe as they turn their interests elsewhere, possibly towards us? As we're worried that the Japanese empire is expanding, even into territories that previously would have been unheard of to even think the Japanese would be able to take that. And as we're thinking about getting these supplies to our allies, somebody says, I know that there was 1,000 people that crossed the border last night. How are we going to send trucks to the Soviets to fight these goons when we've got other issues? And then somebody else stands up and says, well, not only is the border important, what about
Sean
homelessness?
Has donated
and somebody
$20.
else stands up.
How weird was it to see Lonerbox, that slimy cuck bastard, in person, and others with actual legs? You killed it with the moderation, by the way. I love Steven, but you can pull off that radio voice like he can't. I think after going to Ukraine and having to interview people under fire, and I'm not trying to say that these interviews weren't important. It's just that I've been able to, I think, get better control of my temperament in those situations. So in a situation where I'm in an enclosed space and I'm just interviewing, a state representative, it's, I'd say lower stakes. It's a little easier for me to concentrate and try to stay focused and be sharp. But thank you. I appreciate the 20 buccarinos. Thank you. But all I'm trying to get across here is that there will always be issues in the United States that need to be addressed, but saying that we have to address all of these issues before we deal with anything overseas treats it as if the overseas will wait. That they'll wait for us to find some bipartisan compromise with some issue, or they'll wait for election season so you can reshuffle the House and Senate and maybe get the votes to pass it through. They won't. This is a war that's ongoing. If there's a hurricane coming, you can't wait a few months to have policy review about whether or not you need to evacuate the city. You need to be decisive. You cannot enter a period of decision atrophy like this. Continuing. However, as I've been constantly saying, we must deal with the border first. The border is a national security nightmare. Drugs are flowing at record levels. By the way, there's a fentanyl provision in this one, which is not addressed. Drugs are flowing at a record levels across the border. There have been over 7 million crossings, and there is an all-time high of people on the terrorist watch list coming into our country. Hey, I think, that immediate border shutdown that would have come with you guys passing the bipartisan bill, maybe if this was important to you, you would have passed it. Or maybe, since Trump is in there, you're not happy with it. Again, the thing that gets me is I honestly think there's a chance that if Democrats actually tried to pass H.R. 2, and I didn't think this before, but I might think this now, that if Democrats genuinely tried to pass H.R. 2, that Trump would sink it because Trump would think, Biden's stealing my idea. No, he's not allowed to do that. No, I need credit. I need the credit. And then he would try to sink it because that's how he thinks. He doesn't think about, how is my policies going to have an impact on the country? What's best for the people? Because you know how people talk about, like, when the opposition wins, like, for example, if I was to see a Republican president win, or if a Republican was to see a Democrat president win, they'd be like, well, I'm not happy, but I'll root for the president because I want the country to succeed. Trump is the epitome of the exact opposite of that mentality. Wait, there's the other party's in there? God, I hope a nuclear disaster happens. Oh my God, did some soldiers die overseas? Yes, go, get the camera, get the camera, get the camera. That's the vibe I get from Trump. I believe the solution to this problem is the following formula. The supplemental aid package should be a loan to the countries in question, as suggested by President Trump. A loan on friendly...
has donated $15. Hey Dylan, first time dono, love the stream, smiley face.
Thank you for the $15. I cannot respond with a smiley face of my own. I can't, but I appreciate it. I believe the solution to this problem is the following formula. The supplemental aid package should be a loan to the countries in question, as suggested by President Trump. A loan on friendly terms allows America, who is deeply in debt, a chance to get our money back and changes the paradigm of how we help others. President Trump is right to insist that we think outside the box. I hope the House will take another meaningful look at border security so that it can pass the Senate. I also hope that the House will turn the supplemental aid package into a loan instead of a grant. Until that day comes, I'm voting no. Lindsey Graham is asking to take American credibility out behind a shed and put a gun barrel in its mouth and pull the trigger. We made an agreement in the 90s that if Ukraine was attacked after it gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, after we made clear to them we'd make them an international pariah if they didn't give it up, we made a commitment we would come to their assistance in a situation like this. When the Ukrainians entertained our advice during the 8 years of fighting with the Russians before the big invasion and made concessions at our say-so and negotiated and many times at our say-so and signed agreements and many times at our say-so after Barack Obama in 2014 made clear he would not fulfill the agreement then, that he would, do some sanctions, maybe give you a radar to see the bombs coming in, would not fulfill the agreement. Is it now, we'll come to your assistance, but only if you pay us? Is that the way this is going to work? So we're working as a protection racket now? Is that what the United States is going to operate when it comes to Ukraine? It is within our interests for the Ukrainians to win and for the Russians to lose. Not only for nuclear nonproliferation, but economically, with how dominant Europe is economically on the world stage and how intertwined they are with us, with them being our main export economy. It makes sense geopolitically. NATO came to our defense after 9/11. The only time Article 5 has ever been triggered is after we were attacked. They sent their boys with us into Gallivant in the Middle East.
Donated $5.
Even Ukraine did, losing 18 boys
Trump
in
said
Iraq,
he wishes for the country's
even though that wasn't in response to Afghanistan.
About the House working to pass the budget.
So the plan here is to turn the United States military into a protection racket once we sign agreements saying we'd come to the assistance of another country. Is that what we're doing here? Protection racket. So, okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is, what if it is within our interests, but they don't have the money to pay? To be clear, the Ukrainians do not have the money to pay. They barely have the money to pay their own teachers' pensions, let alone pay for some of the most, expensive military equipment on the planet. The Ukrainian armed forces is spending 65% of their budget. 65% of their budget on the armed forces, with their budget supposed to be supplemented by this bill so they can help pay for teacher salary, so the teachers don't have to take unpaid holiday after unpaid holiday just so the school doesn't close down because they don't have enough money to pay the students. If it's within our interest, adding a loan provision, making it a loan instead of a grant, is going to just further complicate the aid effort. And not to mention, even if we start reforming this right now, by the time we've come up with this loan provision and tried to pass it through, what are the odds, due to Donald Trump's sentiment, that he's not going to say, well, look at that, you're stealing my idea. No, you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed, that's my idea. Sink it, sink it. The Ukrainians need to lose, so Biden loses. If the Ukrainians lose, Biden will look bad. That's how I'm interpreting Trump's campaign strategy right now. That's certainly how he's approaching the border. Who says that he won't approach other issues like that? Where Trump starts just calling everybody like, oh no, don't do this fentanyl deal. If you sign a fentanyl deal a year before the election to try to stop all these fentanyl deaths, that'll hurt my campaign. It'll make Biden look good. No compromise, no compromise. What would stop Donald Trump from pursuing the same thing here? Anyway, putting that aside, Lindsey Graham is a hypocrite. This is what he was saying earlier when he was talking about the importance of this, which he is now willing to leverage for his priorities that are, again, unrelated. To know that my commitment to Ukraine has drawn the ire of Putin's regime brings me immense joy. I will continue to stand with Ukraine and for Ukraine's freedom until every Russian soldier is expelled from Ukrainian territory. He said this less than a year ago. 9 months later, you gotta pay us. You gotta pay us if you want help. Our previous agreements, scrap them. This is the new arrangement. Call me Lindsay Soprano. Here's another message from him.
So my message to the Biden administration is I appreciate what you have done. You need to do more. And I am convinced that there will be bipartisan support to provide more weapons that can turn the tide of battle.
Well, it doesn't sound like you were right. Do you think the Ukrainians would be so happy to have him there in Kiev just hanging out, being somebody who's now saying, oh, it should be a loan and we're going to block it after 110, 115 days of undermining this? Lindsey Graham, man, he wants to be where the party is at. This is what I think he's doing. This is what Lindsey Graham's doing. And I'm just going to be blunt with you. I don't like to say everybody's a grifter, but Lindsey Graham's licking, putting his finger up, and looking where the wind blows. Because the only way you can explain this massive shift in the last 9 months is if he's an unprincipled populist trying to dip into that populist sentiment, completely separate for what's best for the nation's security interests, completely separate for what's best for the American economy, completely separate for what's best for American credibility, completely separate for what's best for the future of NATO, Europe, the Ukrainians. It's now what's important is keeping Trump happy. I want to show you some worse statements from senators during this period as they were trying to pass Ukraine aid. Here's GOP Senator Ron Johnson, a starch opponent of Ukraine aid, any assistance. He doesn't think there should be anything given to the Ukrainians, saying that after watching that Tucker Carlson interview, it seems that those sanctions against Putin is actually hurting Russia more than it's hurting the United States.
But an awful lot of what Vladimir Putin said was right. I mean, we're cutting off our nose to spite our face in some of these sanctions. The greatest threat to America in terms of debt and deficit is no longer being the world's reserve currency. Well, these sanctions are making that day come even sooner as Russia is beginning to figure out how to trade in things other than dollars, starting to trade in the Chinese currency. So listen very carefully to that Tucker interview. I mean, understand, take things with a grain of salt. But a lot of the points that Vladimir Putin made are accurate. They're obvious. And so many of our people here in Washington, D.C. are just ignoring that.
Dude, I just don't know what interview he watched, man. You remember Putin said, man, Zelensky's dad. I was talking to Zelensky's father. I was talking to him. I don't know what this accent is. I don't know why this is my Putin accent. Sound more like Steve McMahon has somebody trapped in an alleyway. Anyway, I was talking to Zelensky's father. And man, I said, I was talking to Zelensky about his father. And Zelensky, I was saying, man, why would you ever support all these Nazis? These Nazis, when your father, your daddy, your papa, your papi, he fought against the Nazis and the Red Army. What do you have to say about that, you ethnic Jew? Zelensky's father was born in 1947. If you watch that interview and you walk away with the conclusion that Putin was on a roll and truth-telling, I don't know if he's talking about the 44 minutes from Yaroslav the Wise to all the way to Soviet Ukraine to Orange Revolution, where Tucker is literally saying, can we go? Can we move on? And he's just getting ignored. Putin's dragging him, saying CIA reject, loser. Putin waited 2 hours, made sure he was late 2 hours just to snub his nose at Tucker a little bit more. What was the period? Was it the 44 minutes of history Goebbels of that nonsense? Was it him talking about the Nazis that was on point? Was it the brief mention of NATO? What was it? I just don't know. I guess it's the world reserve currency. I'll talk about that in a moment.
Making people believe like Ukraine can win. No, Ukraine can't. Putin won't lose. Putin will not lose. He's not going to lose. You have to factor that into the reality if you're going to deal with this thing effectively to bring this war to an end.
Okay, so let's talk about this in a few angles. So the first thing is the world reserve currency thing. The Russians wanted to end the United States as world reserve currency before this war, and they were going to want to end the United States as the world reserve currency after this war. The Russians will never trust the United States due to the uncertainty of knowing the United States' interests, and this is if you're a realist, right? Or you don't even need to be a realist necessarily for this. I think some liberals would believe this too. Due to that uncertainty and due to the history of the United States and Russia, it's hard to believe that this administration, especially the one in Moscow right now, the revanchist power in Moscow, is going to ever accept the United States as the permanent world reserve currency and transfer all of its money into the US dollar and greenbacks everywhere. They have been talking about shifting off of the US dollar with BRICS for a very long time. The Russians have offered their currency as a competitor to the dollar to the laughing stock of the economic community, by the way, because the Russians artificially manipulate the ruble like crazy. If you check its prices on the black market versus its actual prices, it's pretty stark. And because of that artificial manipulation, it's not even close to the US dollar. I don't even think it comes up on the radar when it comes to world reserve currencies. The United States dollar is 49%. Its next competitor is the euro at like 20%. Then it's the Japanese yen. Then it's the Canadian dollar. Then it's the Chinese yuan. Then I think it goes to the Australian dollar. And then I think the pound. So my question would be, who's the competitor? The Chinese aren't going to make their currency the competitor. They have the same problem with currency manipulation that the Russians do, just to a semi-different extent. Hell, they're not even saying that they want their currency to be the competitor. In fact, they want nation states to trade in their own local currencies. So my question would be, what sanction do we have in force right now that is ending U.S. global dollar dominance? That's the first thing. And the second thing I would say, how could anyone say that American sanctions aren't having an effect? Whether you're talking about the egg price increases, whether you're talking about the 40 to 50% reduction in government revenues, whether you're talking about all the reserve currencies they had overseas, not reserve currencies, but foreign reserves, the 300 billion that was frozen, whether we're talking about the lack of technological imports that they need for their weapons, whether we're talking about the huge reduction in car sales. I know near the start of the war, I haven't checked car sales since, it was a 90% reduction. The damage that has been done to the Russian airplane industry is going to take a very, very, very long time to recover, as they're cannibalizing much of their plane fleet in order to keep those planes in the sky. And that's pretty important in the largest country on earth, where everything needs to be connected through rail lines and aeroplanes, where the country will quite literally fall apart, as you could not administer the state if it is not interconnected. My goodness, that's not even talking about Oh my God, all the money that has been spent on the war, with them more than doubling the Russian military budget. To say that the sanctions haven't had an effect when the sanctions will continue to have an effect, with millions of Russians fleeing, either to flee the draft or because their jobs left because all those Western companies pulled out. If these sanctions aren't having an effect, why are the Russians trying so goddamn hard to get the sanctions removed? If the sanctions are really hurting the United States more than they're hurting the Russians, then the Russians would say, yes, keep the sanctions. Sanction us more, in fact. In fact, I want you to sanction us more so you can hasten the demise of the United States. We want more sanctions so we can increase our leverage since it's hurting you more economically. And it will be hard to back off domestically when it comes to your embarrassment domestically, politically. So please institute more, hurt yourself. But they're not, because the Russians want us to take off the sanctions because they want to connect American economic problems, whether it has to do with high medical debt or other issues, to their war. Even though the United States and the Russian war in Ukraine, or our sanctions on Ukraine specifically, have very little to nothing to do with the cost of living in the United States right now. There's an attempt to connect these things. And for whatever reason, Senator Ron Johnson has decided to do the Kremlin works for them. The second part here, which is the idea that Ukraine can't win, Senator Ron Johnson. One second, I'm pretty sure that he's not a veteran, but we can check quickly. Or doesn't have any military experience. Does he? Doesn't look like it. Doesn't look like he has any experience. Yeah, no. No, he is not a military officer. He's not a general. He is not a soldier. He doesn't have experience in the field, but he's so confident in saying that. If it's the case that it's impossible for the Ukrainians to win, even though they've got nowhere else to retreat, they've had the bridge burnt behind them. When I talk to the soldiers, they seem to be looking at it like that. They're fighting with no other country that they can go to. This is their only country that they got to defend. The Russians have taken massive losses, burnt through so much of their tank fleet. The Russian Black Sea fleet, 20% of it has been sunk in just the last 5 months. I think even more than 20%. I mean, I could list off all of the damage that has been done to the Russian military. But how can we come to the conclusion that the Algerians can beat the French, the Vietnamese can defeat the United States, the Afghans can defeat the United States and the Soviet Union? That all these different countries can win these wars, that Zimbabwean rebels can beat Rhodesia. Yet Ukraine can't win with more military capability when they're bringing down a taller toll on the Russian public when it comes to how many military losses they're taking and how much armor that's being damaged. How is he so confident that the Russian war machine can just keep this up forever, especially if we give the Ukrainians the tools they need to increase that 1 to 2.5 loss ratio to 1 to 3.5 or 1 to 4 or 1 to 5? I mean, when you look at armor losses around Avdiivka leading up to them entering the city, I mean, 13 to 1 is pretty fucking devastating, wouldn't you say? But no. Ron Johnson, I'm sure he certainly didn't just say he can't win because Putin looked pretty mean in an interview and he just took it at face value and has no military experience whatsoever. So he's just saying whatever is in vogue instead of speaking to military experts. Because I have yet to see any credible military experts saying that the Russians couldn't be put in a position where they would be unable to sustain the war if we gave them the tools necessary. I mean, I could, of course, cite people like Ben Hodges or, you know, those who were involved in training the Ukrainian armed forces and those who were involved in NATO integration with the Ukrainians and those who were involved in NATO command and planning wars just like this one if the Russians were to invade, and their commentary on how victory is very much achievable. And you could, even if you haven't attained victory, you could get a lot more. No, disregard them. Fuck them. Listen to Scott Ritter, Vladimir Putin, and Senator Ron Johnson. Moving on. I wanted to show you Representative Victoria Spartz, who was born in Ukraine, a Republican from Ukraine, who is making the case against the aid to Ukraine. Even though she says she is still personally in favor of aid, she is against this aid package because
Well, reasons. Let's see.
So you don't think that Ukraine needs any aid from the United States?
We need to have weapons, not slush funds. We need to have, but we also need to make sure that this.
Okay, so let me be clear. The bill in question, the majority of the fund, I think it's 20 billion on restoring our own stockpiles, and then like 13.7 or 13.3 on the Ukraine Security Initiative, which means the money isn't a slush fund in the way that we're just giving them a bunch of cash. It's here's the money, you have to spend it on American weapons. So they will then, after being given their price, like 13 billion, they look through what they could buy and they say, okay, we want to buy this, we want to buy that, we want to buy that from American manufacturers. That's not a slush fund. I think it's what, like $5 billion or $7 billion in actual like stuff to help keep the government afloat, since 65% of their budget again is on the military right now, but very little is like how she's describing. The Europeans are the ones that are promoting most of the financing. They're the ones that are providing that. We are the weapons provider. And hell, I would even make the argument that this bill, to be quite frank, and I've said this since the start, even though we've shifted off of it as we're scared that even this bill could fail, is pretty milquetoast in the amount it gives the Ukrainians in weapons. I think it should be increased. Definitely, since the future of Ukraine aid seems to be in peril. At least when it comes to what the MAGA movement would do if they got their way.
Weapons go fast as a deterrence, not go to a lot of associated causes and slow walk the aid. We've been slow walking aid now for almost 2 years. Putin digged in, mined the fields. We now have a serious situation over there, destabilizing now Middle East, who pretty much teamed up with Iran, China, and North Korea, and really causing a lot of headaches. I think we need to be smarter, and we're not doing that.
You said, so Ukraine does need aid. They need weapons. You don't want to see it slow walked. Does that mean then that?
To be clear, Ukraine aid has already been slow walked and American credibility has already been damaged as nation states are questioning exactly what our interests in the region, even though I don't think that there was some big like conclusion done by all the, people engaged in statecraft, all the experts or all of the national security officials, or that all of Congress came together and decided Ukraine aid is a lost cause. The majority of Congress people still support Ukraine aid. This is decision atrophy. And the thing is about decision atrophy, if it looks like we can enter it, then it's not a question of America acting within its own interests. And this is part of the reason why I think the realist worldview is reductive, because these type of internal mechanisms are usually painted over. If a nation state thinks that there's like a 50-50 chance we might just enter decision atrophy, if they were to probe into a NATO state during the Trump presidency, considering his previous comments about abandoning NATO and Russia doing whatever the hell they want, or they think that if they were to push against one of our allies, we might enter decision atrophy as Congress debates and delays any action, then that could motivate them to test American resolve, not only in Ukraine, but elsewhere as well. This is how people talk about how Taiwan could possibly be affected by the breakdown of deterrence. Because if the United States is unwilling to confront a semi-failing Russia that's face-planting in Ukraine for the better part of 2 years, then how are they going to confront who knows how successful Chinese military trying to blockade the island of Taiwan and slowly strangle it? So, just throwing that out there.
That you want House Speaker Mike Johnson to put a vote on the floor for Ukraine aid very quickly?
No, there's not this.
By the way, I'm only using Taiwan because it's the usual example. I think that the impact would be more pertinent regionally, especially around Moldova.
Strange Pains 25 has donated $5. LMAO, is the Hamas caucus serious? Russia is hemorrhaging young people. Hard to field an army of old pensioners because that's all Putin is gonna have left the way
things are going. Well, both the Ukrainians and the Russians have a pretty high average age for their armed forces. For the Ukrainians, it's actually in the early 40s. Now, some people see this and they've concluded that like Ukraine's killed all of its youth or something in the war. And I think that the only reason you can come to that conclusion is if you don't understand Ukrainian demographics. The Ukraine went through a demographic collapse, much like the rest of the post-Soviet war world after the Soviet Union's collapse, which led to them having a lower birth rate, which means that Ukraine is a very top-heavy society. A lot of people in their 40s, 50s, late 30s, in this age range during right before the Soviet Union collapsed.
since Ukraine is facing that demographic issue, they have put in a ton of exemptions for young people. People between the ages of 18 to 27. Now they're talking about a mobilization law that's going to move it from 18 to 25. That's the type of reforms they're doing. They're actually making it so they include more and more young people in the draft pool. They introduced these exemptions for things like students and just things that get young people exempted. There's other exemptions for if you have children. If you don't have kids, you're much more likely to get drafted. And then when you get up in age, you're more likely to have your children age out, become 18, going off on your own, therefore more likely to get drafted. The Russians also have a very high average age for their soldiers as well, especially since they've been very hesitant to mobilize the general population or get rid of the exemptions for a lot of their youth as well. For example, exemptions for students. And that would be probably pretty unpopular.
Bill, this is a slush fund for a lot of causes that President Biden, has all around the world, where we have a mess right now, like giving $1 billion from Ukrainian aid to Yemen.
$60 billion for Ukraine. Do you think you...
Again, they say $60 billion for Ukraine. I wonder if I got to keep clarifying this. 20 billion of this is literally just replenishing U.S. stockpiles. So when we say 60 billion to Ukraine, 20 billion of this is also just replenishing stuff that we had sent over and replacing it with newer stuff.
Ukraine could use.
So like, that's another thing that baffles me about this. Oh, we're just saying all this overseas. A significant portion of this is literally replenishing our own stockpiles. In fact, I would argue that maybe that money should maybe go to something else. But point is, like, it's not a slush fund for Ukraine.
But you need to understand. But let me tell you, let's just read. And I haven't, listen, I haven't read this particular package, and I'll be open-minded, but I've read all other ones. Most of the stuff it says we're going to send to Ukraine and associated causes. A lot of causes around the world. A lot of this money don't even go to weapons. 10 to 20% generally go to weapons directly earmarked for Ukraine.
Again, this is deceptive because it makes it sound like 80% of it, or like 50% or a very high percentage, is just going to be cash sent to Ukraine. Again, this is a lie. I think of the 60 billion, I think it's only like around 5 billion that's actual financing. 20 billion is replenishing U.S. stocks. Like 13.7 or 13.4 is the actual Ukraine Security Initiative, where they can use that to buy weapons from the United States. And this has been held up since, again, like September of last year. The fact that she hasn't read this bill and she's already stumping against it on CNN is also pretty embarrassing, I have to say, especially since she's accusing it of being full of things that it really isn't.
So I haven't read this bill that it passed. I don't want to comment, but if it is the same with every other bill we passed, I have a problem with that. Because ultimately, we're not going to, deter Putin with blankets, only with weapons. We need to have
I do need to throw out there that if Ukrainians aren't alive, and they can't shoot the Russians. I'm going to throw out, so things like humanitarian aid do matter. Now, there is more of an issue when it comes to the reselling of humanitarian aid in Ukraine. It's a real corruption issue. But again, the majority of this is not humanitarian aid. You made it sound like a very small percentage went to weapons, but that's just because this bill also includes a bunch of aid to other things, like, for example, Taiwan and Israel, which, as far as I know, she also supports. So I don't know what the point she's trying to make there, outside of trying to be misrepresentative with the numbers.
American weapons produced here sent directly to front lines with proper oversight and strategy, not slow walk that aid, because we're dealing with very
You're slow walking the aid right now.
People that causing a lot of headaches around the world, and a lot of people are dying.
Causing a lot of headaches. I wonder what when I hear the Polish Prime Minister saying shame on the Republicans, when I see Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian MPs, former British prime ministers, the German chancellor coming over to the United States trying to slap sense into the Republican Party with no progress, you're saying that it's caused. Well, what do you think is causing the chaos here? When you see that happen, how do you interpret that event?
So it causes us a lot of
not putting votes on the floor. Is not.
Yeah, let's watch a little bit more from this fantastic interview. This is my favorite part of it. I kind of just wanted to get through this so I could show this. So John Berman, the CNN interviewer, asks, are you for or against Vladimir Putin and Russia doing whatever the hell it wants? And then she just, I think, vomits a bunch of words
on him and harsher.
Are you for or against Vladimir Putin and Russia doing whatever the hell it wants?
Well,
so again, for those of you who are unfamiliar, Trump recently said at a rally that he told NATO officials, NATO countries, that, hey, if you're attacked and you're not paying the 2%, which is not a membership fee, by the way, it's the recommended percentage, which people should be paying, but I don't believe hitting 1.9% should be determinative on whether you're going to be occupied by a foreign power. I think it degrades the credibility of the alliance. He said if they don't pay, then he won't come to their defense and he'll tell the Russians to do whatever the hell they want. So that's why he's asking about do whatever the hell they want, quote.
Putin and Russia doing whatever the hell it wants.
Well, listen, you know, I think we will love him for such a long time, and that's why it is we need to be seriously. There are so many lives of people that actually right now getting destroyed, and how that people, it costs money, but a lot of lives, and what destabilization create, and really the crimes and brutality
It sounds like you're against. It sounds like you're against Vladimir Putin doing whatever the hell he wants. The reason I was asking is because Donald Trump.
Listen, let's just understand. Yeah, he's not our friend, but let's just be honest. He only understands trends. He only understands trends.
Wow, I wonder if we're sending an image of strength right now. Do you think America, when we're slap fighting in Congress for 115 days about whether or not we should give the Ukrainians like 13 billion in the Security Assistance Initiative, which they could get from our stockpiles, and replenish our own stocks and give them some financing, if that is causing a slap fight for 115 days, it's going to be hard for them to think that our support for Ukraine is solid, and it's going to be hard for them to think that our support for Ukraine is going to be consistent. And so it doesn't make that much sense for them to give up right now. If possibly in the next year, we're just going to give up. And hell, Sergei Shoigu said openly that the plan is for the Russians to fight till at least 2025. Now, what happens in 2025? Well, either Biden has his term renewed and he goes for a second term, or Donald Trump comes into the office.
If we're not strong, he will do that. And
okay,
and
so if a Republican presidential candidate who may end up being president says, "I hope Russia does whatever the hell it wants," how will Putin respond to that?
Well, listen, you know, President Trump, he does a lot of campaigning, but he's been a tough negotiator.
It's just words. Don't worry. Don't worry. Don't believe your lying eyes and ears. I'm sorry. But you cannot pretend that you're strong on this issue or strong on the Russians or they're projecting strength if you're saying after we've been negotiating this for 115 days and Trump sunk the border deal because he didn't want any compromise on it because it can make him look bad, and we're finally going back to square one and trying this again, and you want to stop it for a mythical slush fund in a bill you didn't even read? I don't know how much you're really, I don't know how much, I gotta ask, how seriously are you taking this?
If you think about him pushing NATO allies to meet 2%, is it good for Putin or it deters Putin more? Do you think pushing Germany not to be dependent on, you know, on natural gas from Russia, is it really good for Russia or actually?
Wait, but that's not good diplomacy because he failed. It would be, you know, this would be an incredible thing to brag about if Trump convinced the Germans to get off of Russian oil and gas and go onto American LNG, but he didn't. It was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It was America's failure to deter the Russians from invading Ukraine that convinced the Germans to shift, as we had the largest war in Europe since World War II. You can't give that to Donald Trump. Why is that his to brag about?
Or do you think giving weapons, not blankets like Obama did to Ukraine, do you think it's deterrence? And he's the one who actually told Putin, not under my watch. So I wouldn't worry about what he's campaigning, but what he's thrown action.
Don't worry about what he says. If he says, die, Ukraine, die, I mean, that's like that's actually just like a thing all the kids are saying these days, like a slang term. It's a term of endearment, really.
Deter a lot of aggression and brought a lot of peace during his watch, and aggressors didn't move.
So just again, you say don't worry about his campaign. You don't take Donald Trump at his word?
Oh my God, she sucks so bad. Like, what did she think? Like, so, I mean, like, if your conclusion is Trump just says things, then you have to say, yes, our presidential nominee, you should not believe at his word. Yes, when he says things while running for president, he could be serious, he could be joking, it's hard to tell. You know, he says one thing, does another, who knows?
How is that? How does that make your candidate look better? It's just they can't accept what he said and what he means and what he intends to do. So, or what he would like to do. And so they just have to pretend it didn't happen or say, you know, when he says things, he just says things.
No, listen, you know, there are a lot of campaigns, but I look at actions. You know, I look at, and the words he said to Putin, not under my watch, and Putin didn't move. But under President Biden's watch, he did move. And that is the reality. And now we have a serious war. So I'm not looking at politicking. I'm looking, the situation is very serious right now. Okay. We have a very serious war in the Middle East, in Europe, and we have to really get together. And
let's be clear. I do not think that Donald Trump questioning in interviews if he has any dedication to defense of NATO and saying, do whatever the hell you want, and withholding aid to Ukraine unconstitutionally to leverage for information on Trump's political opponents, because again, everything he does is transactional, is necessarily inspiring confidence in our security arrangements. No, I don't agree.
Congress needs to really get stronger to put pressure on the administration.
Oh yeah, we need to pressure Biden on Ukraine aid. That's the issue right now. My God, in a perfect world, we would be. She responded to this, by the way, because she didn't like the framing of everybody saying she's making the case against aid to Ukraine. Very interesting that so-called journalists, air torpor, just attacks Republicans with misrepresentations of what was said. Facts are, Biden failed the American people with our border and Ukrainian people with their border. We can't have more slush funds and embarrassment. She still didn't read the bill, and she's still talking about it like she read it. Continuing. Now, I do want to show some of the Republicans, and I don't, you know what, I'm not only going to show one, really. I do want to show that not all Republicans are coming out and sinking the aid, because actually, the majority of Republicans, at least from what I would see, might be against it in public, but I think due to the amount of public pressure from the MAGA base, that there could be a scenario where a majority of Republicans are in favor, but they're too scared to either publicly show it. But we at least know in the Senate that we have 20 Republicans that are in favor of Ukraine aid, either for, you know, maybe their state produces some of the weapons that are being sent over. Maybe there's some interest there. Maybe they genuinely care about our national security priorities. For whatever reason, they were able to get 20 people together to end up passing this bill. So, like what we're going to watch in a second with Hakeem Jeffries and what he's saying about House Republicans, there are Republicans that support aid to Ukraine. Here's Senator Tom Tills, who's getting destroyed in the replies by the MAGA crowd, talking about why he supports Ukraine. I'll watch just a few seconds of it. Let me read one of these. Remember when we won the Cold War by forcing the USSR to spend themselves into poverty? I guess we fell into that trap. Dog, what in this, does he know about like the Soviet-Afghan War? Did that contribute to them winning or losing the Cold War? Whatever. Anyway, let's watch. This Congress cannot be remembered in the pages of history for emboldening Putin and Xi. That's why I voted in favor of the national security assistance package to support Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan.
A lot of people say we're sending $70–80 billion to Ukraine. Really? Well, last time I checked, about half of it's going to the military-industrial base here to replace the inventories that we've sent to them, to replace and to aid our modernization.
There's more of it is dedicated to replacing our stockpiles than funds dedicated to the Ukrainian security initiative. I can play. Why? What the fuck? Dude, I'm sorry. I hate the new Twitter UI system. I hate all the bots. I hate all the sex bots and the replies. And I hate the click a video and it takes you to another place like this. I hate it.
Of our arsenal. We have billions of dollars in this bill to actually build up our defense industrial base that we now know, thank goodness, this is not against a NATO ally, because we would be desperate trying to actually support an all-out war now. But thank you, Vladimir Putin. If anything good came from this, we know how weak your military is. A 10-to-1 ratio of Ukrainians to Russian soldiers dead. And I feel bad for
I'm sorry, the 10-to-1, I don't know where number he's getting that. I have no clue where he got that number. He might be talking about armor losses.
Around Avdiivka, I remember hearing 13-1. It wouldn't be 10-1. I don't know where he got the 10-1 number.
Every one of those Russian families who lost somebody in this war that they didn't want to be a part of, 87% of their ready forces when Putin started this war. Putin is losing this war, folks. This is not a stalemate. This guy is on life support. He will not survive if the 50 nations who have come together in the Ramstein process to support Ukraine stick together. He will not survive if
Look, I want you guys to listen to their words, because if in a year he's changed his tune, once Trump's in there or Trump decides he wants to pull up the pressure, I want us to remember, just like Lindsey Graham, how aggressive they were, because man, I've seen a lot of defenders of Ukraine get pretty servile recently in the Republican Party. Hell, there are even Republicans in Congress who would support Ukraine, but just due to the fact they don't want the MAGA backlash, just keeping it to themselves.
NATO becomes stronger. NATO's already got one and about to have a second ally that is only here because of Vladimir Putin. He's made NATO stronger. He's demonstrated that he is weak. He's demonstrated that he is losing. We all heard the classified reports that are now public that we thought that Russia was going to have air superiority within a couple of days and control all of the Ukraine that they wanted to control within a couple of weeks. Well, folks, that was 2 years ago. Ukraine is winning. And Ukraine is winning because the Western world, the NATO allies, and 24 other countries have come together and made it very clear that Putin's desire to reestablish the Russian Empire is inconsistent with a democratic world order. Putin is losing. This is not a stalemate. A 10-1 kill differential between Ukrainians and Russians is indisputable. The platform.
Okay, I think I'm sick of clicking this. I think I'm done with this, but again, I don't know where he got that number. In comparison, here's the other side of the coin in the Republican Party. Here's Ohio Senator J.D. Vance reading Dr. Seuss on the House floor to slow down the Ukraine bill's passage.
Waiting for the fish to bite, or waiting for the wind to fly a kite, or waiting around for Friday night, or waiting perhaps for their Uncle Jake, or a pot to boil, or a better break, or a string of pearls, or a pair of pants, or a wig with curls, or another chance. Everyone is just waiting. No, that's not for you. Somehow you'll escape. All that waiting and staying, you'll find the bright places where the boom bands are playing. With banner flip-flapping, once more you'll ride high, ready for anything under the sky.
I don't like green eggs and ham. I think someone should hit him with a van. Look, I don't like JD Vance very much. I'm not like the biggest fan of Tim Ryan. Tim Ryan would have been a much better senator though, and we wouldn't get this Dr. Who's rendition to slow down the aid. Not because, oh, you know, we're against the Israel aid principally. Like Bernie, for example, if you look at the people who voted against the aid, he actually voted against it as well. Bernie was one of the only people to end up voting against the aid. I think you can also see Welch voted against the aid, or I think abstained. I think Welch voted against it and Bernie abstained. So you can't stand against that principally, not because it's Ukraine aid, but this is just to slow down any aid to Ukraine. It is to make sure that every second is used to maybe, you know, just slow it down a little bit more as Ukrainians are trying to stay above water. And he's trying to do it with humor and in reference to past filibusters. Isn't that fun? It'd be funny if people weren't dying. But it passed, and Mitch McConnell, the leader of the Republicans in the minority in the Senate, he went forward and said, look, I think there should be a vote. Here's the quote. We've heard all kinds of rumors about whether the House supports Ukraine or doesn't. It seems to me that the easy way to solve it would be to vote. And I agree. Look, all of this has been delayed, not because Ukraine aid is unpopular. Ukraine aid is still popular in the House. Ukraine aid, as we can see from the 70-vote passage, even if I think it was passed independently of Israel aid, is still popular. Popular in the Senate, popular in the House, and popular in the presidency. And even if you were to use the credible bad data, like data that shows decreasing support amongst the American public, the last piece of, I think, really credible data from a professional pollster I saw was Pew Research in December, and that still showed a plurality of Americans thinking we should continue to send aid to Ukraine. So bills like this, or what I would advocate for, increase aid to Ukraine. I'm part of the 18% that believes in that. Point is, though, Ukraine aid is still popular. And so if you had an up or down vote on Ukraine aid, it would pass. In fact, I'm not the only person who thinks it would pass. I know that, and we're going to get back to him in a bit, House Democrat leader Hakeem Jeffries, said that he believes he has over 300 bipartisan votes. Be clear, you only need 216 to pass it in order to pass aid to Ukraine, and it wouldn't be a problem to get a discharge petition. We're going to get back to that in a second. We're going to get back to Hakeem Jeffries in a second. But despite the fact that it would make sense to have an up and down vote, despite the fact that Mike Johnson said that they would not abandon Ukraine, that they would not do the thing that they're doing right now at the start of his administration, they seem set to dig in with his heels. Speaker Mike Johnson won't take the Senate-passed National Security Supplemental as is, insisting House Republicans will write their own legislation. Democrats are trying to plot a path around it. We'll get into that in a second. Why would Mike Johnson, after sinking with Donald Trump the immigration deal, because after getting all those things that they wanted and asked for and not having to give the Democrats things like reforms on Dreamers, now that they've sunk that, why not just pass the aid as is? Why do we have to drag this on even further? Well, I'll give you an idea as to why. Well, here's one reason. There are certain House Republicans that seem to be set against Ukraine aid altogether. I know Marjorie Taylor Greene has been set against Ukraine aid altogether. Let's listen to one of these House Republicans, Representative Warren Davidson, talk about it.
If the Speaker were to put the Senate package on the floor, what would that mean for his ability to hold on to the gavel?
He would need Democrats to hold on to the gavel at that point.
Because there would be an effort to push him out?
Yeah, I mean, multiple of my colleagues have already promised that. I believe that it's not an empty threat, and we'll see how it would resolve. But I think he would clearly need Democrats to be able to hold on to the gavel if he went straight to the floor with this Senate package.
Would you vote to oust him in that situation?
Well, I don't like answering hypotheticals, but I do think that the question would get asked.
Now, Johnson today essentially ruled out putting this bill on the floor, contending that it needed to have tougher border security restrictions. Of course, Johnson essentially scuttled the bipartisan border security deal in the Senate because he said it did not go far enough. But this effort that Democrats are now discussing,
it went too far, honestly.
Is trying to circumvent Johnson altogether to try to get enough support procedurally to force a vote on the floor that would require the support of a majority of the House, meaning.
What is he talking about at the end here? Well, I'll tell you what he's talking about at the end here. They're going to force a vote? What are you talking about? Is there a cheat code I'm unaware of? Well, I want to talk to you guys about what a discharge petition is, because it seems that the Democrats are done. It seems that Hakeem Jeffries is done. They're done playing patty cake. They're done playing ball. They're done trying to find a compromise, and they're just going to try to jam the thing through by using a rare rule. Barely works, usually doesn't. Either the speaker would back down to not be embarrassed, or, it just would fail. They wouldn't be able to get enough votes. The House seems to be approaching, or the House Democrats, a discharge petition. So what is a discharge petition? Well, a discharge petition is a petition that could be signed by House members. And if they can get a majority of signatures of the House, then they have to look at the legislation that the petition signatures are about. So, for example, if there was a bill in committee, there's a few different types of discharge petition, but let's say there was a bill in committee and the committee chair didn't want to bring it to the House floor. If there was a vote, a general vote on whether it should be brought to the House floor, they could take it straight out of committee and boom, bring it there if they signed enough petition signatures, if they got enough people to sign on. In this case, they would be circumventing Mike Johnson bringing it to the House floor by getting, at bare minimum, if they have every single Democrat, that assumes Ilhan Omar, AOC, Rashida Tlaib, would sign on to a deal that includes aid to Israel, which I don't think is a given, that's for sure. But assuming that they would, because they would think it would pass without it anyway, as the Republicans have pursued it, whatever logic they would use, they would need 4 more votes in order to bring it to the floor. Now, in the past, back in the 30s, it used to be that the votes were in secret. So the idea of, you know, a big backlash until after it was successful. So them trying to do a pressure campaign, that was more difficult. And so that was an advantage for those signing the discharge petition. And you only needed 1/3 of Congress. But in the 30s, there was legislation introduced, they reformed it, and now you need a majority. Now, will this succeed? I don't know. Let's listen to Hakeem Jeffries talk a little bit about it. And then I'll talk to you guys about why it may or may not succeed.
Thank you so much, Abigail, who of course served this country.
By the way, I want you guys to remember something, all the Ukraine supporters. And I know that because I've gone on shows like Mercado Media's and others, that I have a kind of more diverse pro-Ukraine audience, some of which are right-wing, some of which are Republican. I am not going to put a gun to anyone's head and tell them who they shouldn't vote for, who they should vote for. I do believe that voting blue this election is the smart move, especially for supporting Ukraine. But whatever your perspective, please take note that as the Republicans dragged out the Ukraine aid discussion for over 110 days, going on 120, costing valuable lives, time, and resources to the Ukrainian defenders, as they're unable to plan for the future until aid packages like this are approved, it was the Democrats that were championing getting the aid through, and it was the Republicans in the House that were blocking the aid getting through. Doesn't mean all the Republicans, but a majority. And some of them, like Lindsey Graham, who had previously hinted they were pro-Ukraine, once put under pressure by the MAGA crowd and Trump, well, that's a 180. I just want you guys to take note of that. That when you're voting in 2024, who would be the safe bet for securing America's national security interests? And not as a buzzword, not as I'm bombing some random country, but having European stability in our main export market. Having it so that a war couldn't spill over into NATO because they've degraded our deterrence, or believe that our deterrence is degraded because we've entered decision atrophy. Or, you know, maybe taking the signal from someone like Donald Trump that, oh, Russia, do whatever the hell you want. That could send a wrong message. I'm just saying, consider it.
Country.
I do also think the Democrats should have done more, yes. But when your options is this or Marjorie Taylor Greene taking point on Ukraine policy when she believes babies are being harvested to fund the war effort, I think the choice for me is clear.
In such a distinguished way in the CIA, and of course, thank you to all of the members who are here, Jason, Mikey, Salud, Chrissy, who served in the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and Marines. And I also want to acknowledge the presence of two additional distinguished veterans, Jake Auchincloss and Seth Moulton, both of whom are Marines, put their lives on the line, and served in combat overseas. Questions?
When you discuss using every legislative tool possible, I know there's been a lot of talk about a potential discharge petition to get this to the House floor. But is there any concern that you might lose more Democrats on one side of this to try to get a discharge petition than Republicans would be willing to come over and sign on to it?
This would probably, I think this is in reference to some who would want to break over the Israel.
No. All options are on the table. We're going to utilize every available legislative tool.
That is what we needed to hear. We needed to hear we will use every tool at their disposal. If that's the case, then a discharge petition is on the table. If he's standing by these words and he doesn't back off of it, this would mean the rare option of a discharge petition would be on the table.
And what is clear is that there are more than 300 bipartisan votes in the House of Representatives to pass the national security bill today. More than 300 bipartisan votes. It's not too much to ask in America's national security that we get an up or down vote and let the House of Representatives actually work its will, as opposed to allowing Donald Trump to work his will and block our national security priorities.
Leader Jeffrey, just to follow up, so how many Democrats do you think you would lose on this, first of all? And secondly, have you actually begun that process of reaching out to Republicans to sign on to a discharge petition?
We're going to have a conversation in our leadership meeting today. We'll also meet as a steering and policy committee and then as a caucus family tomorrow morning to discuss the precise steps that we will take. But it's clear to me that the overwhelming majority of House Democrats are ready, willing, and able to support the national security bill right now. We're not the problem. The problem is on the extreme MAGA Republican side. Let's be clear. They need to end the partisanship, the brinksmanship, and the gamesmanship and work with us in a bipartisan way to get this done. Let me also yield just to Seth and Jake.
I think you get the idea. It seems that Hakeem Jeffries, at this point, has decided, and I hope these are not hollow words, all gloves are off. Let's see if we can humiliate the House Speaker one more time. And so, if you hear the number 300 bipartisan votes, and they only need 216 signatures, potentially, then obviously that sounds like pretty good odds. But this isn't the 1930s anymore. These votes aren't private, and you only need 1/3. You need half, which means they need to pick up at minimum 4 House Republicans. Now, out of the 80 plus that he said that'd be willing to sign on to something like that right now, 4 doesn't sound like a tall order. But when you realize that those 4 people that would have to come forward publicly and sign on to it after the Democrats didn't lose a single Democrat, and for every Democrat they lose, they need to get another, so maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 Republicans. Every single one of them is going to be hammered and hammered and hammered by the MAGA Republican isolationist right. Donald Trump might get involved, start calling them individually, saying, hey, I'll support your primary opponent. I will run a primary opponent against you. Now, some of them might look what happened with the Secretary of State in Georgia and the candidate that Trump ran in the primary there, which failed. Like, oh, well, you know, maybe I'd be safe. You know, maybe they'd see how Doc Hollywood, Dr. Oz didn't feel safe. Or maybe it would be a Kerry Lake situation or a I don't know, maybe J.D. Vance is a better example. Some success situation. They feel like they'd actually be challenged and they'd back off. Who knows? Trump will try everything he could to pressure them. I really do think he might. I think it's likely that he will. I'll say like 90% chance. And so will these 4 to 5, 6, 7, 8 Republicans be able to stand the heat and bring it to the House floor around Mike Johnson, which would be ultimately very humiliating for Mike Johnson? In fact, depending on how the talk goes behind the scenes, some people might see his failure to drag those Republicans back and stop this type of petition, a discharge petition, as a failure of him that could be impeachable. Not impeachable. What's the word? Recallable. That they could use it to do a recall vote, saying, you know what, he failed us again. Let's do a recall. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, bringing it to the floor for a vote himself could also cause a recall. So he seems in a difficult position. But he might be betting on the idea that even if they did a discharge petition, by the fact that he didn't facilitate it, maybe he'd be safer from the MAGA right. I do want to note that it seems like the Republicans that have some frame of reference to support Ukraine, for some reason support Ukraine, they don't seem to have the balls necessary to do a recall vote over Ukraine aid, though. I do want to throw that out there. And so with those Republicans having that much heat against them and possibly humiliating their House Speaker after they were humiliated already on Israel aid and the first 2 Mayorkas attempts, I think, yeah, it's maybe a little higher of an offer than the 300 number would originally have you believe. Do I think it's impossible? No, but I do think it comes with difficulty.